In Britain, we have a much weaker tradition than here of philanthropic foundations in the field of education and research, but it is growing, as are advocacy think tanks. But people often do not distinguish between different types of research and the distinctive missions of different types of foundation. In the context of international policy borrowing, this may be even more of a problem than at home. In my country, for instance, most politicians would know that the Institute of Economic Affairs or the Centre for Policy Studies, both neo-liberal and neo-conservative think tanks, are a very different type of outfit from the Nuffield Foundation. But British politicians would not know that the Manhattan Institute or the Bradley Foundation were very different from the Spencer Foundation. And I imagine it will be the same the other way round. And then media stories carry details of research, but rarely distinguish between different types or between the different degrees of robustness. Media reports, of course, also become the source of evidence for policy in their own right. And there are, of course, crossovers between these different types of research. Chubb and Moe undertook their policy tourism, which I mentioned earlier, as a commission for the Sunday Times. And almost at the same time, Susan Chira, the education correspondent of the New York Times, sent her on the same journey. Interestingly, Shira made more use of academic research findings in her reports than did Chubb and Moe. And possibly that's why she produced a more nuanced verdict on the English reforms than Chubb and Moe's outright enthusiasm. But one of the features of media reporting, and hence perhaps wherein lies its appeal to politicians and advocacy groups, is that it tends not to distinguish between anecdotes on the one hand and peer-reviewed research findings on the other when weighing up evidence. Now let me give you an example of that relates to my earlier discussion of the way in which current government in England is using US charter schools to justify its own policy of freeing up the system by creating academies and free schools outside the control of local school districts. This particular use of anecdote comes from policy tourism on the part of the person who now runs something called the New Schools Network, a charity that's been engaged by government to promote free schools and which models itself quite consciously on the New York City Charter School Centre. This particular account comes from the Sunday Times in February of this year, but the same story has appeared in a number of other press articles on Rachel Wolf's work. That's the name of the person who heads this New Schools Network. And the press report says her inspiration to set up the New Schools Network, which will act as a backroom operation, providing administration and advice, came from a trip to New York. She flew there when working as a researcher for Michael Gove, the Conservative Party's education spokesman. The party has championed the new movement, promising to permit as many as 3,000 new free schools, which are modelled on Sweden's free schools and America's charter movement. She said, "I was reasonably convinced that the new schools the Tories were talking about would work, but I wanted to see them for myself." And then the story goes on. In New York, she saw the contrast between dysfunctional public schools and some of the disciplined, creative charter schools. Sometimes both types were housed in one block. And she says, on the floor of a building I visited, on one floor of a building I visited, a girl was being told to put on her hat. I watched her fling it at the teachers. When the lift doors opened on the floor of the charter school, by contrast, an 11-year-old came over and asked, ever so politely, would I like to be escorted around? And I came back to Britain and decided this was what I wanted to do, she continues. I cannot think of any other idea that excites me so much. And of course, when the new government was elected, she was given money to do that. So anecdotes like that are very important in the discourse of policy borrowing. Nevertheless, there are appeals to mainstream research funding which do act also as a key feature in policy legitimation. Indeed, in a posting on the Guardian website at about the same time as that story, Wolf herself cited research from Sweden, the USA and Alberta, Canada as evidence that new schools, charter schools, perform better, that they have a positive effect on neighbouring schools, and the poorest benefit most. And after some of my colleagues suggested the evidence from Sweden was not all that robust, she then moved, focusing her attention on charter schools. And the coalition government itself, just as soon as it had been elected and announced its policies, produced a document on the website of the Department of Education entitled Mythbuster. And I've got a few copies here if anyone wants to see the whole document. It included, along with selective use of UK and Swedish research findings, the following references to research on US charter schools. I'm not going to go through all of this, but for instance, a recent study concluded that Boston's charter schools have a consistently positive impact on student achievement. New York has instituted a report card system with charter schools that perform better than other schools, with the majority receiving A's and B's. Recent studies from Chicago and Florida indicate that charter school students have higher ACT scores, higher graduation rates, and a greater probability of attending college. Charter schools in New York have been shown to dramatically close the gap, separating inner-city neighbourhood students from those of wealthier suburbs. The Harlem Children's Zone charters have completely closed the black-white achievement gap. Charter schools in Chicago closed half of the gap. US charter schools are enormously oversubscribed. 91% of New York charter schools participate in free or reduced price lunch program, compared with 72% of students in traditional state schools, hence showing challenging the myth that charter schools only benefit the better off. Another myth, preschools will covertly select the most able pupils, and they say the major report on Chicago charter schools found that charters drew students who were on average lower achieving than public school students. Now, this document quotes different types of research, some newspaper reports, some academic research. And I sent it to some US researchers to gauge their reaction. And this is the sort of response I got. This is from one of them. Most of what they're saying is true, but quite skewed in selection and interpretation. They only selected studies like the recent Hoxby study of New York City over and over that support their claims. And some of the localities that they studied have generally good charter schools. However, they ignore the other, usually larger and more representative studies, like the Credo study, that cast serious doubts on their agenda. For what it's worth, I don't think any of the studies they cite were peer-reviewed, and almost all were done by charter advocates. They're not only selective in choosing studies, but in making claims from those studies where all the usual caveats and cautions of research disappear. For instance, their claims about higher test scores show no indication that they're aware that charter schools often shed more difficult to educate students, and I gather that's an issue with Geoffrey Canada's, one of Geoffrey Canada's schools. They say that charters don't skim based on Hoxby's 2005 magazine article, which was in fact based on three schools in one city. I, says this person writing to me, can point to a number of other peer-reviewed studies that show the opposite.